Hey everyone, tonight we're going to start with a group of women from the TUDOR era who thought moral codes were just polite suggestions. The TUDOR world was obsessed with virtue, chastity, and how people saw them in public. This makes its scandals even more fun to watch. So, before you sit back and relax, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming to see us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make a soft noise in the background. And let's slowly get into tonight's deliciously dirty history lesson together. Anne Boleyn didn't just hurt people, she ruined the Catholic Church. That's not an exaggeration, that's her resume for dating. Henry VIII was a typical Renaissance king before her. He was loud, vain, a little dangerous, and married to a woman he had stopped liking several feasts ago. Anne then came in, said no, and England hasn't been sober since. Anne wasn't pretty, the way poets wrote about it. She was magnetic, smart, and good at making powerful men look stupid. She had gone to school in France, which in Tudor terms meant she knew how to read and flirt, two things that are very suspicious in a woman. Henry tried his usual royal charm, but Anne turned him down so politely that he thought she was playing hard to get. For 7 years, he chased her like a lovesick teen with a tax base, sending her letters, gifts, promises, and everything else. He gave her jewelry. She told him to be patient. He promised her love forever. She looked at him blankly until he built her a church. He finally got the message and took England out of Rome. Their marriage started with fireworks and ended with accusations of cheating, incest, and witchcraft. In short, the whole Tudor starter pack. Anne had a daughter, Elizabeth I, which would have been fine if she had been a boy. Henry wanted a son, someone to carry on his name, and someone to blame when things went wrong. Instead, he had a daughter who would later make him look like a footnote. Anne, on the other hand, didn't. Help her out. She was smart, sarcastic, and wouldn't laugh at bad jokes. In the 16th century, these were traits that were seen as high treason. People started talking, proof was found, and all of a sudden she was sleeping with half of the royal musicians. Her brother even got involved, which is when you knew the court gossip mill had really run out of ideas. Her trial was a show. Everyone already knew how it would end. She stood tall, gave a calm defense, and was put to death with French precision. They said she was immoral and manipulative, and evil, which is what men who can't control her call every strong woman. Anne didn't just seduce a king, she seduced fate, and by doing so, she made England a lot more interesting, a lot more bloody, and a lot more kinkier. If Anne Boleyn was the woman who made Henry VIII break the church, Catherine Howard was the one who took away his last bit of pride. Henry was in his 50s, overweight, and as romantic as a sack of flour when she came into his life. Catherine, on the other hand, was a teenager who was full of life, innocent, and grew up in a home that would make modern social services cry. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin, which in hindsight should have been a warning sign. The Howards liked a certain type of person, beautiful, ambitious, and drawn to bad choices. Catherine was put in court as a lady-in-waiting, which was basically a royal girlfriend audition in Tudor England. Henry saw her right away, and she probably saw his crown, or his money. Their courtship didn't last long, and their wedding was even shorter. By 1540, Catherine was queen, and Henry was sure he had found his youth again. He told her she was his rose without a thorn. The poor man didn't know that roses grow best in poop. Catherine did a great job of playing the doting young wife until she started sneaking around with a handsome courtier named Thomas Culper. It wasn't even secret. They wrote love notes to each other, set up meetings, and spread rumors faster than syphilis. At the same time, an older ex-boyfriend named Francis Darham showed up and wanted to be recognized. When the husband is the king, it's always a good career move. The change was biblical when Henry found out. The act of being a loving husband disappeared overnight. Catherine was dragged out of Hampton Court, screaming, questioned, and found guilty of treason, which in TUDA language meant making the king look stupid. She said she was sorry for her sins and that she had liked pleasure more than virtue at her execution. Later, historians argued about whether she was innocent, stupid, or just a teenager in the worst arranged marriage in the world. The answer is probably all three. Catherine Howard was young, not ready, and attracted to a man who thought divorce was a game. She became a warning story in history. In TUDA England, love could get you a crown, lust could get you killed, and being both could make you famous. Before Anne Boleyn convinced Henry VIII to change the Bible, her sister, Mary, got there first, without making a sound, without breaking any rules, and without any problems. Mary was the first, charming, flirty, and completely unconcerned about what might happen in the future. As a teenager, she went to the French court, which was basically Europe's most expensive finishing school for scandal. There, she is said to have enjoyed French education in every way possible. People said that King Francis I was one of her lovers. He called her my English mare. That isn't a metaphor. That's how polite how Renaissance dealt with shaming. Mary was already well known for her diplomatic skills when she got back to England. Of course, the TUDA court thought she would make a great wife. She married a minor nobleman named William Carey. His main role in history was to stand next to the king while he slept with his wife. Henry saw her soon after that, and when Henry saw it, careers were over. Compared to other royal affairs, theirs was pretty quiet. No divorces, no executions, just quiet gifts, quiet gossip, and the odd. The royal baby that no one wanted to talk about. Mary had 2 kids, one of whom, Henry Carey, looked so much like the king that even the portrait painters started to cough politely. But Mary wasn't a planner. She didn't have the drive or survival instinct that her sister Anne had. Henry got bored and left, leaving Mary with bills that were too high and her looks fading. Anne became queen, and Mary was pushed to the side where she did her biggest scandal yet. She married for love. William Stafford, her second husband, was a soldier of low rank and no money. The TUDOR elite were shocked. A Berlin marriage for love. Gross. She was kicked out of court for acting in a way that was degrading to herself. This seems like a little late for moral outrage, since she had been the king's mistress before. Mary spent the rest of her life quietly in the country, where she was poor but happy, according to reports. A rare ending for a woman from TUDA. No beheading, no imprisonment, no papal bull, just peace, chickens, and the joy of having. Outlived everyone who had anything bad to say about her. She began as a royal mistress and ended up as a happy wife, showing that the most perverted thing a Tudor woman could do was live. Jane Shaw was technically from the generation before the TUDOR, but they couldn't resist stealing her story because it was so scandalous. She was the first woman to fall, and every other woman who fell after her was based on her. Jane started out as the wife of a man who was smart, beautiful, morally flexible, and destined to become a sermon illustration. A respectable merchant from London, the kind of man who probably smelled like numbers. Then she caught the eye of King Edward IV, who was more charming than strict. Everyone knew about their affair. The court loved her, the church hated her, and Edward acted like she was England's favorite sport. But Jane wasn't greedy or manipulative, like most royal mistresses. She was really kind, which is a rare and dangerous trait for a royal mistress. She used her power to help those in need, pardon prisoners, and talk the king into not killing people before breakfast. She was the only one who wasn't cruel in a cruel court. A nice person who was in the wrong job. Jane's luck ran out when Edward died suddenly in 1483. Richard III became king and needed someone to blame for his own holiness. Jane was perfect because she was pretty, outspoken, and had just lost her job. He said she was a witch, seduced him, and was generally lewd. She had standards and wouldn't pretend to be sad. Over a dictator, people talked about her punishment for a long time. She had to do public penance for her sins. So she walked barefoot through London in nothing but a thin white chemise. This outfit shocked and fascinated the crowd at the same time. People who wrote about her said that the public cried for her. In reality, half of them passed out, and the other half went home with her. But Jane made it through. She lived long enough to see herself become a moral lesson, then a folk hero, and finally a ghost story that warned people, told by preachers who were secretly interested. She didn't commit adultery. In a time when women were expected to be quiet, ugly, and easy to replace, it was having a personality. Jane Shaw never wanted to be the most famous penitent in England. But when the church tried to make her feel bad, she turned her repentance into a show, and every teacher would later learn that a well-planned sin lasts longer than any good deed. Every royal court needs at least one woman who likes to flirt with her pen. And in the time of Henry VII, Mary Shelton was a lady-in-waiting who could turn innuendo into literature and literature into trouble. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin, which meant that she was already likely to get into trouble. The Binns weren't a family. They were more like a dynasty of flirting. Just looking at each other could start a political crisis. Mary was a perfect fit, smart, funny, and able to speak the universal language of accidental double meaning. The Devonshire manuscript has her poems in it. Were a classy mix of love, sarcasm, and light dirt. They were about faith and desire on paper. In practice, they sound like TUDA pickup lines with better words. When I remember your parting face, mine heart doth ache in every place, she wrote once. That's a beautiful line, but it might not mean what your high school English teacher thinks it does. People in court passed around Mary's poems like gossip that was really art. The elite of the Tudors loved poetry that sounded moral but felt not decent. It made sinning seem classy. Her lines hinted at secret glances, lost kisses, and other things that would have gotten her an exorcism if she hadn't been so charming. People say that she also caught Henry's eye, but whether that was physical or poetic depends on how much you like Henry's reading skills. He found her young, smart, and sure of herself to be both very attractive and very scary. Thank goodness she never went too far. Into full mistress status, which probably saved her life, literally. Mary Shelton was one of those rare Tudor women who could seduce without touching, insult without getting in trouble, and live without saying sorry. While her more ambitious cousins were going crazy, she was writing poems about heartbreak and probably laughing at what was happening to everyone else. Most 16th century female poets are forgotten by history, but Mary wrote in ink that was sharp, scandalous, and hundreds of years ahead of her time. She never ruled she didn't rule a kingdom, but she did something that might be harder. She stayed funny, alive, and just perverted enough to make her poems last forever. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rowford, was one of the best accessories for every Tudor scandal. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room quietly and set it on fire. Jane was smart, observant, and always wanted to know what was going on. She didn't start scandals. She just wrote down what they said and poured oil on them. She married George Boleyn. Yes, that Boleyn, Anne's brother, a man whose charm didn't quite survive contact with reality. Live through contact with reality. Their marriage was very unhappy. She thought he was full of himself. He thought she was tiring. Jane decided that if she couldn't be loved, she might as well be feared. This was after the insults and the quiet times. When her sister-in-law Anne Boleyn lost her job, Jane came forward to help as a witness. She said that Anne and George were a little too close, and her testimony helped get them both killed. Historians still argue about whether she did it out of jealousy, revenge, or just an amazing lack of self-awareness. No matter what her reasons were, Jane became one of the rarest types of women, a Tudor woman who lived through someone else's downfall. For a while, she didn't look up. Then Catherine Howard, Henry's teenage wife, came along, and Jane thought, I could be useful again. She became the young queen's confidant, which in TUDA terms meant she carried messages, arranged secret meetings, and kept watch while Catherine had diplomatic meetings with Thomas Culper. When the affair was discovered, Jane tried to act surprised, which was impressive since she had literally helped plan it. The interrogation didn't go well. Under pressure, she broke down, ranted incoherently, and briefly went insane, which delayed her execution because it was considered rude to behead lunatics. Once she was well enough to stand up, they killed her anyway. At her beheading, she apologized for slandering the innocent queen, meaning Anne. It was the 16th century version of I may have gone too far. Jane Boleyn's life reads like a cautionary tale written by someone who hated subtlety. Betray one queen, destroy another, lose your mind, and die on a cold February morning. In a court filled with liars, she was simply better at it until she wasn't. If TUDOR England had a LinkedIn, Elizabeth Bess Holland would have listed her profession as mistress of influence and selective morality. She wasn't royal, noble, or particularly well born. But she had one talent that mattered in the 16th century. She knew how to make men in power forget what they were thinking. Bess became the mistress of Thomas Cromwell, the king's right-hand man and the original bureaucratic shark. Cromwell was cold, brilliant, and allergic to affection, but he kept Bess close. Historians think she softened him, but it's more likely that she reminded him that pleasure still existed between executions. At court, Bess was both admired and feared. She wore silk when others wore linen, smiled when others prayed, and collected secrets like other women collected jewelry. People said she helped more than one ambitious nobleman, but helpful in Tudor slang usually meant candlelight and regret. Cromwell's enemies whispered that Bess had too much access, too much power, and not enough shame. In a world where even queens got beheaded for looking smug, that was a deadly combination. When Cromwell fell from grace, accused of treason, overreaching, and marrying Henry to the wrong woman, Bess vanished. One day, she was draped in velvet. The next, she was gone like spilled perfume. There was no trial, no record, just silence. Some say she fled abroad. Others think she bribed her way into anonymity. A few romantic chroniclers say she slipped into a convent, but the odds of Bess Holland volunteering for celibacy are about the same as Henry becoming a vegan. What we do know is this. For a brief, glittering moment, she navigated the deadliest court in Europe, armed. Bess disappeared after marrying Henry to the wrong woman. One day she was draped in velvet, and the next she was gone like spilled perfume. There was no trial, no record, just silence. Some say she fled abroad, while others think she paid to stay anonymous. A few romantic historians say she entered a convent, but the chances of Bess Holland volunteering for celibacy are about the same as Henry becoming a vegan. What is certain is this. For a brief, glittering moment, she navigated the deadliest court in Europe, armed with nothing but wit, charm, and an unshakable talent for survival. Bess never got her portrait, her title, or her happy ending, but she got something rarer. She lived in TUDOR England. That was an achievement worth engraving on a tombstone. She remains the ghost of Cromwell's ambition, a courtesan in silk, forgotten by history, but remembered by every man who thought he could control her and learned otherwise. If ambition had a perfume in Tudor, England, it would have smelled like Anne Seymour, Duchess of Somerset, expensive. She was cold and slightly poisonous. She was the kind of woman who didn't smile unless it was on purpose. Her beauty was famous, her calmness legendary, and her reputation was best described as cold with a chance of death. Anne married Edward Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, and the only one who could have a legitimate son without getting divorced or beheaded. That made Edward the uncle of the future king and Anne the queen of every important corridor. She wore her new. Anne treated the other ladies in waiting like unpaid interns with mild contempt and clear instructions. When Edward became Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector for the young Edward V, Anne effectively became England's unofficial queen without the annoying humility that came with the actual crown. She built grand houses, hosted lavish feasts, and had her servants call her Your Grace, with the kind of intensity that made it clear they might not live long if they forgot. But under the icy polish was a woman who knew how dangerous it could be to be soft. The court called her cold-hearted, but that was mostly because men didn't like being outsmarted by someone wearing pearls. Anne knew how to use silence as a weapon and charm as a disguise. She wasn't scandalous in the traditional sense. She didn't have lovers, drunken parties, or secret letters. Her perversion was more subtle. She wanted power, not bodies. Of course, in TUDOR England, a woman who didn't giggle or people were automatically suspicious of feint. When her husband fell out of favor and was killed, Anne was thrown into the tower. Her crime was being too good at being herself. She was later released, but the damage was done. Her influence melted away faster than candle wax at midnight, and Seymour died quietly, which is a miracle for a TUDA noblewoman. She left behind no great lovers or juicy scandals, just a reputation for being terrifyingly competent in a world that preferred its women to be beautiful, brainless, and expendable. In short, Anne didn't seduce men, she scared them. And that was somehow even more dangerous. By the time Catherine Parr got to court, Henry VIII had run out of both cartilage and wives. He was old, paranoid, and one ulcer away from a medieval fireworks display. Catherine, on the other hand, had the one quality that none of his previous wives had, common sense, which made everyone suspicious. Catherine wasn't born to be a queen. She was a twice-widowed noblewoman who had spent her life quietly reading books, taking care of estates, and avoiding being beheaded. She was smart, kind, and religious, which were three things that were very bad in Tudor England. When Henry proposed, Catherine politely accepted because saying no to the king usually led to a sudden interest in French architecture, specifically the Tower of London. She became Henry's sixth wife in 1543 and immediately set about doing what no one else had been able to do, keeping him alive and relatively calm. She nursed his wounds, flattered his ego, and managed to smile convincingly while he compared her to his dead exes. But Catherine wasn't just a nursemaid with pearls. Beneath the modest gowns and psalms was a sharp political mind. She supported Protestant reform, published her own theological writings, a bold move when writing anything could get you executed, and debated religion with the king himself. Henry found this fascinating right up until he didn't. One evening, he reportedly muttered that he should have her arrested for heresy. She flattered his ego and made him smile while he compared her to his dead exes. But Catherine wasn't just a nursemaid with pearls. She was a sharp political mind who self-reported Protestant reform, wrote her own theological works, which was a risky move at the time, and debated religion with the king himself. Henry found this interesting until he didn't. One night, he reportedly muttered that he should have her arrested for heresy. Catherine, sensing that divine reasoning was losing to royal indigestion, quickly threw herself at his feet and said she'd only argued to distract him from his pain. Henry melted instantly. It was the 16th century version of "I was only joking." After Henry died, Catherine finally got what she'd always wanted: freedom. She married Thomas Seymour, the handsome, charming, and utterly untrustworthy brother of Jane Seymour. Unfortunately, she discovered that being a widow with money and a husband with ambition was only slightly less dangerous than being married to Henry himself. Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, having outlived Henry VIII and outsmarted nearly everyone else. She was the only Tudor queen who managed to leave the marriage alive, literate, and still mildly sarcastic, which statistically speaking makes her the period's biggest success story. In a court full of loud scandals, Elizabeth Bessie Blount managed to become Henry VIII's mistress without setting the palace on fire. A rare achievement in an Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, having outlived Henry VIII and outsmarted almost everyone else. She was the only Tudor queen who managed to leave the marriage alive, literate, and still mildly sarcastic, which statistically speaking makes her the period's biggest success story. In a court full of loud scandals, Elizabeth Bessie Blount managed to become Henry VIII's mistress without setting the palace on fire, a rare achievement in Anne. In a time when seducing the king usually meant public shame or sudden widowhood, Bessie was beautiful, charming, and most dangerously agreeable. Historians call her modest, but what they really mean is that she was smart enough to know when to stop talking. She first appeared at court as one of Queen Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting, which was basically the Tudor equivalent of being an unpaid intern in proximity to disaster. Henry noticed her during a dance, which was both flattering and deeply unsafe. He liked how graceful and young she was, and most of all, he liked that she didn't argue with him about religion. Their affair was short, sweet, and surprisingly scandal-free. There were no public letters, no temper tantrums, and no continental wars. Bessie knew the first rule of royal romance: never outshine the monarch. She was so discreet that she was almost invisible, which made her even more attractive. When she got pregnant, the whole court pretended not to notice, which is impressive since they weren't very good at being subtle. Really the TUDOR brand. In 1519, she gave birth to Henry Fitzroy, the king's only acknowledged illegitimate child, a name so grand it sounds like he came prepackaged with a crown. Henry adored the boy, showered him with titles, and even considered making him heir. For a brief moment, Bessie's son stood on the edge of destiny until he died young as most TUDOR heirs inconveniently did. As for Bessie, she handled motherhood and royal discard with equal composure. Henry rewarded her with a nice marriage to a quiet man named Gilbert Tailboy, which was like an early retirement package in the Renaissance. She had more children with him, stayed out of trouble, and lived long enough to see her more ambitious successors lose their heads, literally. Bessie Blount wasn't a schemer or a saint. She was a woman who understood the dangerous math of power. One affair, one son, and 0 executions. In the blood-soaked soap opera of Tudor, England, that made her practically a genius. While others chased crowns, Bessie chose to live. And in Henry's England, that was the most tempting thing to do. If TUDOR England were a chessboard, Frances Howard would have been the queen who smiled sweetly while knocking over all the other pieces. Born into the powerful Howard clan, professional survivors of royal mood swings, Frances was raised on court politics, gossip, and the unshakable belief that sin is just strategy with better lighting. Her story unfolded during the tail end of the TUDA age, when the crown had passed to the Morley. The Stuarts were tired, but the court's thirst for scandal hadn't changed at all. Frances was young, beautiful, and married to a man she hated, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He had all the sexual appeal of a damp tapestry, even though he was a title. Bored and beautiful is a dangerous combination. Frances fell in love with Robert Carr, the king's favorite, which means the man His Majesty liked to flirt with while pretending not to. To be with Carr, Frances needed an annulment and ensued a law that required proof her marriage hadn't been consummated. So she told the court that her husband could not perform. Then, just to prove it, she allegedly smuggled in a substitute woman for him to fail with in front of witnesses. Imagine the world's worst dinner party, but with legal implications. Her annulment succeeded, and she married Carr. For a while, it looked like a fairy tale, until a man named Sir Thomas Overbury wrote a poem calling her immoral. Naturally, she poisoned him. When she was caught, she lied, then told the truth, and then said it was okay. This didn't win her any friends, but it did get her and her husband locked up in the Tower. Most Tudor women in that situation ended up dead or forgotten. However, Frances flirted her way into a royal pardon. She and Carr were released, disgraced but alive, which is a win in TUDOR England. After that, she lived quietly, but she sometimes showed up in gossip as a fallen woman. Devout. Whether that was real repentance or just another act, we'll never know. Frances Howard was proof that in a world run by men, the most perverted thing a woman could do was refuse to play the victim and still get away with it. If you wanted to map out Henry VII's family tree, Margaret Douglas would sit somewhere near the top, probably rolling her eyes. She was his niece, the granddaughter of Henry VII, and therefore royal enough to be important, but not quite important enough to be safe. In TUDOR England, that was like being born holding a target. Margaret had beauty, charm, and the kind of romantic instincts that make biographers sigh heavily. Her life was a sequence of forbidden love stories, each ending in prison, scandal, or both. She treated royal bloodlines the way other people treated horoscopes. Interesting, but not a deal breaker. Her first great disaster was Lord Thomas Howard, uncle to Anne Boleyn, and professional bad idea. Their romance bloomed while Henry VIII was busy breaking up his own marriage. The king, who didn't like being upstaged in love, called their engagement treasonous. Both were put in the Tower, where Thomas died and Margaret got out after promising to fall in love again. Of course, she did right away. Her second affair with Charles Howard got her locked up again. You'd think she'd have learned, but Margaret had the soul of a poet and the self-preservation instincts of a candle in a gale. Every man she chose was either politically radioactive or already claimed. The woman had a type, and that type was career-ending. Still, Margaret wasn't stupid, just stubborn. She understood that love was both her weapon and her weakness, and she wielded it accordingly. Later in life, she became the matriarch of a dynasty that would outlast all her tormentors. Her grandson, James V/6 of Scotland, would eventually become James I of England, uniting the crowns that had destroyed half her family. So yes, the woman who spent her youth flirting herself into prison became the grandmother of a king who ruled both kingdoms. Not bad for someone whose hobbies included treasonous romance and stubborn survival. Margaret Douglas's story reads like a TUDOR version of a tragic comedy. Too royal to be ignored, too passionate to behave, and too smart to stay quiet. In a world where one wrong glance could cost a head, she blinked deliberately twice and somehow kept hers. If you wanted to make Elizabeth I furious, all you had to do was exist beautifully, quietly, and with red hair. Unfortunately for Lettice Knollys, she did all three. Lettice was Elizabeth's cousin and inconveniently her mirror image. She shared the same Tudor blood, the same golden complexion, and the same talent for turning powerful men into fools. In another life, she might have been Elizabeth's best friend. Instead, she became the Queen's living nightmare. Younger, married to the Queen's secret crush, and very much alive. The man in question was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's lifelong heir. Lettice Knollys did all three of these things. Lettice was Elizabeth's cousin and looked shit like her. They had the same Tudor blood, the same golden skin, and the same ability to make powerful men look stupid. In another life, she might have been Elizabeth's best friend. Instead, she became the Queen's living nightmare. She was younger, married to the Queen's secret crush, and very much alive. The man in question was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's lifelong favorite, the maybe lover historians still argue about. When he secretly married Lettice in 1578, it wasn't just a betrayal, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. Imagine marrying your boss's boyfriend and then showing up to work the next day wearing his coat. Elizabeth handled the news with her usual regal composure, meaning she screamed, banished Lettice from court, and referred to her as the she-wolf. Dudley was forgiven, of course. TUDOR England had a long-standing policy of blaming women for men's enthusiasm, but Lettice wasn't the type to cry. Instead, she went back to her estates, put on some velvet, and lived like a queen without the paperwork. Her marriage to Dudley was loving, but she did inherit his huge debts, enemies, and reputation for mismanaging everything he touched. Still, she kept her head, which was a real achievement in a family that lost several. After Dudley's death, she married again to a younger soldier named Sir Christopher Blount. This did not. Lettuce's relationship with Elizabeth got better, even though Elizabeth was now both old and jealous, which is a dangerous mix. When Blount joined a rebellion against the crown, Lettuce was briefly imprisoned on suspicion of sympathy, which is royal code for the Queen still hates you. But she outlived them all. Elizabeth died without children. Lettuce lived to 88, an absurd age in Tudor, England, mostly because of spite. Lettuce Knollys was proof that you didn't need a throne to rule. You just needed good bone structure and better husbands, and the patience to wait until your enemies died first, which fortunately they always did. Few women in history have been both saint and scandal, but Mary, Queen of Scots, somehow managed to be both, often in the same week. Born to rule and raised to ruin expectations, she lived like she was being graded on drama. If Elizabeth I was icy calculation, Mary was fire in human form, beautiful, impulsive, and allergic to good decisions. She became queen at 6 days old, which sounds impressive until you realize it just meant she inherited a country full of angry men in skirts. The Scots loved her in theory, but plotted against her in practice. After being married off to the French Dauphin, she spent her youth in Paris learning how to charm courtiers, quote Latin, and outdress everyone within 50 miles. When her French husband died young, Mary returned to Scotland, a widow, a queen, and still fabulous. Her next marriage to Lord Darnley looked good on paper. He was handsome, noble, and Catholic. In reality, he was a jealous drunkwith. The emotional stability of curdled milk. When he accused her of cheating, Mary's patience ran out faster than his sobriety. Not long after, Darnley's house mysteriously exploded, and someone also helpfully strangled him, just to be sure. Subtlety was not the Scots' strong suit. Enter James Bothwell, the rugged noble who rescued Mary from danger by allegedly kidnapping her, though accounts suggest she didn't resist very hard. Their scandalous marriage united Scotland in outrage, even for TUDOR. Standards: marrying your husband's prime murder suspect was considered bold. Rebellions followed. Mary fled, and she sought shelter in England. An idea so catastrophically bad, it deserves its own monument. Elizabeth I received her cousin warmly, then locked her up for 19 years. Mary spent nearly 2 decades under house arrest, embroidering, praying, and occasionally plotting the Queen's assassination. When Elizabeth finally executed her, Mary wore red, the color of martyrdom, and presumably defiance. History remembers her as tragic, sensual, reckless, a queen who confused love for destiny and romance for such strategy. But to be fair, her story ended exactly as she lived, loudly, beautifully, and one dramatic gesture away from sainthood. Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't rule her fate. She seduced it, and fate predictably couldn't resist. If the Tudor dynasty were a tragic play, Elizabeth would be the final act, the one where everyone's dead, the stage is on fire, and somehow the last character still looks perfect. They called her the Virgin Queen, but that title has been winking at history for 500 years. Elizabeth inherited a country that was broke, divided, and traumatized by her father's marital hobbies. As a child, she saw her mother beheaded, her stepmothers disappear mysteriously, and her own imprisonment by her sister. By the time she became queen, she'd learned the two most important Tudor survival skills. Trust no one and accessorize like your life depends on it. She was smart, clever, and allergic to marriage proposals. Every European prince tried Spain, France, and even the Holy Roman Empire. But Elizabeth treated marriage like it was the plague. Her stock answer was, "I am married to England," which sounds noble until you realize that England was the most demanding husband imaginable. Still, the gossip never stopped. Her relationship with Robert Dudley, the dashing Earl of Leicester, remains one of history's favorite will they or won't they stories. They tragedies. He was charming, handsome, and married, a trifecta of TUDA danger. When his wife conveniently fell down a staircase and broke her neck, Elizabeth's court whispered murder. The Queen handled it like a professional by pretending not to hear anything. For all her talk of chastity, Elizabeth surrounded herself with handsome courtiers who wrote her poetry so steamy it would have made a monk sweat. Yet she maintained her image as untouchable, the eternal flirt who never crossed thee. Historians still argue about whether that restraint was virtue, calculation, or just good time management. Her reign was long, glorious, and sometimes crazy. She beat the Spanish Armada, funded pirates she called privateers, and went broke on dresses, jewels, and flattery. When she died in 6003, unmarried and childless, she left behind an empire and about 10,000 rumors that were never answered. Elizabeth's so-called virginity was her greatest political weapon. It made her sacred, desirable, and impossible to control. She didn't need a husband. She made an entire continent compete for the title. The Tudor line ended with her, but her legend didn't. The Virgin Queen never gave herself to anyone, which in a way means she owned everyone. Before death rolled down from the mountain, Pompeii was just another lively Roman town basking in the southern sun. The morning began like any other. The streets clattered with iron-rimmed wheels, bakers hauled loaves from smoky ovens, and the fountains splashed cool water for slaves carrying amphor. The air smelled of olive oil, perfume, and fish sauce, the everyday scent of prosperity. Mount Vuvius loomed in the distance, green and serene, its slopes covered with vineyards that produced the region's beloved wine. Nobody feared it. In fact, they worshipped it. To the Romans, Vuvius was a symbol of fertility, not destruction. Wealthy citizens prepared for a day of business and leisure. In the Forum, magistrates debated taxes under marble porticos. Across town, a gladiator wiped oil from water for slaves carrying amphor. The air smelled of olive oil, perfume, and fish sauce, the everyday scent of prosperity. Mount Vuvius loomed in the distance, green and serene, its slopes covered with vineyards that produced the region's beloved wine. Nobody feared it. In fact, they worshipped it. To the Romans, Vuvius was a symbol of fertility, not destruction. Wealthy citizens prepared for a day of business and leisure. In the Forum, magistrates debated taxes under marble porticos. Across town, a gladiator wiped oil from. As he trained for the games that night, artists painted frescoes on the walls of villas, capturing lovers, gods, and myths that seemed to last forever. Even the brothel was open for business before noon. Pompeii was very efficient. In Herculaneum, the smaller coastal town, fishermen mended their nets by the sea, laughing as children splashed in the shallows. Smoke rose from kitchen hearths where women simmered lentils and salted anchovies. The sun climbed higher and the heat shimmered off the paving stones. Everything seemed normal until the dogs started barking. Around noon, the ground shook slightly. The locals hardly noticed. Minor earthquakes were common in Campa, but the shaking didn't stop. Birds flew off rooftops, and a faint rumble came from the mountain. Some people stopped and looked up for a moment before shrugging it off. Life went on as usual. By early afternoon, the air became strangely still. A faint sulphurous smell wafted through the markets, mixing with the smell of figs and wine. Farmers on the slopes saw the first puff of dark smoke curling from Vesuvius Peak. They thought it was just another small fire, maybe a shepherd's signal, but that smoke wouldn't clear. It would rise, spread, and darken the sky, for now, though Pompeii and Herculaneum carried on, unaware that this ordinary summer morning would soon be frozen in ash, preserved forever as the last perfect moment before the world ended. It began with a sound, not thunder, but something deeper, a low, figs and wine. Farmers on the slopes saw the first puff of dark smoke curling from Vesuvius Peak. They assumed it was another small fire, perhaps a shepherd's signal. But that smoke would not clear. It would climb, spread, and darken the sky. For now, though, Pompeii and Herculaneum carried on, unaware that this ordinary summer morning would soon be frozen in ash, preserved forever as the last perfect moment before the world ended. It began with a sound, not thunder, but something deeper, a low, a continuous groan, as if the earth itself were exhaling after centuries of silence. Birds disappeared, and dogs whined and ran through the streets. Then came the first explosion. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the summit of Mount Vuvius cracked open. A jet of black smoke and molten debris shot up with terrifying force, forming a huge column that clawed into the blue sky. Pliny the Younger, writing from across the bay in Misenum, said it looked like a pine tree rising to the heavens. It's to the trunk the pillar of. The smoke was like ash clouds spreading out from the branches. Within minutes, the sun began to set. People in Pompeii flooded the streets, craning their necks toward the mountain. At first, there was more confusion than fear. Some people pointed, amazed at the sight, which they thought was a fiery omen or sign from the gods. Others ran to temples to pray to Jupiter and Vulcan, hoping to find meaning in the chaos. Housewives gathered their valuables, while fathers argued about whether to stay or leave. No one really understood what was happening. Then the ash came. Fine, gray particles fell like snow. At first, people laughed and brushed it off their hair and tunics, but soon the flakes got thicker and made the air darker and made it easier to breathe. The sun disappeared completely behind a rolling curtain of black. Torches were lit, but even their flames seemed to shiver in the suffocating dust. By the second hour, roofs began to creak under the weight of pumice stones. The noise was unbearable, the hissing of falling ash, the thunder of distant eruptions, the screams of people and animals. The wind carried the choking sulfur across Campa. Those who tried to flee found the roads buried and the air unbreathable. Still, some stayed behind, convinced it would pass. After all, the mountain had been calm for generations. Perhaps the gods were angry, but surely they would forgive soon. But the column rising from Vesuvius was no ordinary eruption. It was 20 miles high and growing, feeding a rain of molten rock and fire that would not stop for 18 hours. The people of the Pompeii had seen the first sign and didn't realize that the end had already begun. By noon, the mountain's rage was at its peak. The sky over Pompeii had turned from blue to a thick, bruised gray. The sun disappeared behind the volcanic cloud, and the city fell into a strange twilight. People stumbled through the streets, covering their mouths with cloth, their eyes streaming from the sulfur. Every breath tasted like burnt stone and smoke. The ash no longer fell gently. It came down like hail, thick and hot, covering everything. Every surface was covered in gray powder. Roofs sagged. Statues disappeared under the weight. Families huddled together with oil lamps inside their homes, listening to the muffled roar that never stopped. It got louder every hour, like an endless thunderstorm trapped inside the earth. Doors and windows rattled. The rich tried to escape with their jewels and servants, but the streets were buried ankle deep in ash and pumice. Wagons overturned. Horses fell over in fear. There was nowhere to go. Every road led back to the mountain's wrath. Then came the lightning. Flashes of fire danced within the volcanic plume, illuminating the chaos below. Some swore they saw the gods themselves in the sky. Jupiter hurling bolts in anger, Vulcan hammering deep beneath the crater. Superstition spread faster than the smoke. Priests shouted prayers, others tore their tunics begging for mercy, but the gods had gone silent. In Herculaneum, closer to the sea, the situation was different, but no less dire. The wind spared them from the ash for now, but the earth shook violently. The walls cracked. The sea started to pull away from the shore, as if it were being pulled by something unseen. Fishermen ran to the beach in confusion, not realizing that the water was gathering for something much worse. Back in Pompeii, it got darker. The streets were filled with the cries of mothers holding their children, men calling for lost relatives, and animals trapped in stalls. Some people sought shelter in temples, while others dug trenches in the hope of waiting it out. A few people with grim determination went back home to protect what they owned, not knowing that they were. The air was now unbreathable, and the world shrank to a few feet of visibility. Ash covered everything: homes, bodies, dreams, until Pompeii itself began to disappear beneath the mountain it once adored. By the time night should have fallen, it was already darker than night. The volcanic column over Vesuvius, now miles high, began to collapse under its own weight. From it came a storm of pumice stones, burning fragments of rock, and molten debris hurled down upon the city. Each impact echoed like hammer blows. Roofs caved in, porticos splintered, the proud marble temples of Pompeii cracked and crumbled under the assault. People ran blindly through the chaos, clutching torches that did nothing against the suffocating blackness. Some tied pillows to their heads for protection. Others hid beneath tables or in cellars. The air glowed red, flickering with bursts of lightning trapped within the swirling ash. The gods no longer seemed angry. They seemed absent altogether. Only the mountain spoke now, and the proud marble temples of Pompeii cracked and crumbled under the blows. Roofs caved in, porticos splintered. People ran blindly through the chaos, clutching torches that did nothing against the suffocating blackness. Some tied pillows to their heads for protection. Others they hid beneath tables or in cellars. The air glowed red, flickering with bursts of lightning trapped within the swirling ash. The gods no longer seemed angry. They seemed absent altogether. Only the mountain spoke now, and the voice was like thunder that never stopped. In the city, chaos turned to desperation. Streets turned into rivers of hot, fast-moving pumice. Slaves tried to free their masters' carriages, but the wheels got stuck in the debris that was piling up. Families yelled at each other through walls that were already cracking from the tremors. One man dragged his old father through the streets, both of them coughing up blood from the sulfur. Another man tied a cloth around his child's face and whispered a prayer, but the mountain's roar drowned out his voice. The rocks were bigger, heavier, and deadly. Each one hit the ground with the force of a catapult. Anyone who was outside was crushed. The air was filled with the smell of burning oil, charred wood, and flesh. In the amphitheater, where crowds had once cheered gladiators, there was only silence. The ash fell evenly over the marble seats like a burial shroud. In Herculaneum, things took a dark turn. The retreating sea had revealed the seabed, which was covered in gasping fish. Many people ran toward it in awe, just as a wall of steam and fire shot back from the horizon. The first pyroclastic surge raced toward the shore. It was over in seconds. Those who saw it never had time to scream. Back in Pompeii, the people huddled in their homes believed the worst had passed. They were wrong. The rain of fire was only the beginning. Beneath the ash, something far deadlier was forming, an invisible tide of heat and gas that would sweep everything away. As dawn approached, though no one could see it, Vesuvius unleashed its deadliest weapon. The massive column, the thing that had risen miles into the air, finally fell down. What came next was not lava or fire from above, but a rolling avalanche of death. It was a pyrolastic surge, which is superheated gas, ash, and stone that moved faster than any horse could run. At first, it moved silently, but then it sounded like 1,000 chariots charging downhill. In Herculaneum, they heard it too late. Survivors who had fled to the shoreline saw the wave of smoke descend from the mountain, glowing from within like molten glass. The heat was over 400 degrees. Sea turned flesh to ash before screams could form. Dozens took refuge in the boat ooses, huddling together in the dark, clutching one another as the blast hit. Their bodies would remain there for nearly 2,000 years, perfectly preserved in agony. The surge did not stop. It raced down the mountain's flank, incinerating everything in its path. Vineyards, olive groves, and villas vanished. When it reached Pompeii, it tore through the city like a god's breath. Roofs ripped away, walls exploded, bodies thrown across rooms. Those who had survived the night's bombardment now faced instant death. There was no escape, no mercy. The very air became a weapon, dense and boiling. Inside one villa, a group of people covered their faces with cloths, praying the storm would pass. In a single instant, they were frozen, their lungs scorched, their outlines sealed in ash. A woman clutching a child, a man shielding his wife, a dog chained by its collar, all preserved, immortalized in terror. Above them, Vuvius thundered again, sending another surge, sweeping. The mountain's power seemed endless, and their rage was absolute. The once bustling city that had been full of laughter and trade was now a gray wasteland of twisted shapes and collapsed roofs. By the time the last waves hit, Pompeii was gone. The gods of Rome, Jupiter, Venus, and Apollo were silent beneath 30 feet of ash. The world above would forget the names of its victims, but the mountain remembered, and beneath its gray tomb, the people of Pompeii lay waiting, statues in the dust, frozen in time. The moment life turned into history. When the roaring stopped, the Bay of Naples became eerily quiet. The sky, which had been full of fire and thunder, was now heavy and still, with a gray haze that dimmed the morning light. The air smelled of sulfur and death. Ash drifted across the sea like snow, covering boats that floated silently, their oars abandoned. The world had gone quiet, too quiet. From Misenum across the bay, the Roman admiral Pliny the Elder watched the mountain's wrath from the deck of his ship. The previous, he had sailed out with a fleet to rescue people stuck along the coast the night before. But when the first pyroclastic flows hit Herculaneum, his ships had to turn back. The sea boiled, the wind died down, and an oppressive darkness swallowed the horizon. He never came back. Witnesses later said he collapsed near Stabia, suffocated by toxic fumes. A man of science consumed by the very curiosity that made him great. The survivors who managed to escape the region stumbled through an unrecognizable landscape. Vineyards were gone, rivers had changed course. Entire towns had vanished beneath layers of ash so thick that even roads disappeared. Farmers searching for their homes found only hills of gray where villages once stood. The mountain loomed above them still, its peak torn open and steaming like a wound that would never heal. For days the ash continued to fall, smothering everything within miles. The few who returned to dig through the ruins found only silence. The faint outline of doorways, the occasional charred beam, the ghostly impressions of the dead. They whispered that the gods had buried Pompeii for its sins, that Venus herself had turned away from the city that had worshipped her in name, but not in virtue. As weeks passed, nature began its quiet reclaiming. Grass sprouted through cracks in the ash. Birds returned cautiously. The memory of the eruption began to fade into rumor. A warning turned into myth. The empire moved on. Rome itself barely noticed. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, they slipped beneath the surface of history, sealed in their ashen tombs. For almost 17 centuries, they slept, waiting for the day when their story would rise again from the dust. Centuries passed. Grass grew over the buried towns, and the memory of Pompeii faded into legend. Farmers plowed fields over the ash, unaware that beneath their feet lay entire streets, frozen in the moment of death. The mountain, now quiet and deceptively calm again, became part of the landscape once more. Travelers passing through Campia saw only fertile soil and olive groves, never imagining the vast necropolis sleeping below. By the Middle Ages, the name Pompeii had vanished from maps. The Romans who survived the disaster had long since died, and their descendants no longer knew where the city had stood. Some believed it had been swallowed by the sea. Others whispered that the gods had buried it on purpose as punishment for arrogance. And so, the mountain was left alone, its story buried as deeply as its victims. Then, in 1599, a canal digger unearthed something strange. Frescoed. They thought the soil and olive groves were all there was to Pompeii, but they had no idea that a huge graveyard was sleeping below. By the Middle Ages, the name Pompeii had disappeared from maps. The Romans who survived the disaster had long since died, and their descendants no longer knew where the city had stood. Some believed it had been swallowed by the sea. Others whispered that the gods had buried it on purpose as punishment for arrogance. And so, the mountain was left alone, its story buried as deeply as its victims. Then, in 1599, a canal digger unearthed something strange. Walls, bones, and strange writing under the volcanic earth. But the find scared more than it fascinated. The workers sealed the site again, fearing the gods' anger. It would take another 100 years for curiosity to win out over superstition. In 1748, under the rule of Charles III of Bourbon, systematic excavations began. What they found shocked the world. Entire villas appeared, their paintings still bright and their mosaics still intact. Bronze statues stood in courtyards, undisturbed since that last.